All right.
Okay, so this is a chart that I started to use just to help me keep track of the different groups of 4 caucuses that I'm presenting on this evening. And then as I put it together, I thought it probably would be useful for other people to just sort of help them follow along in what I'm saying. So, and I want to thank Gerald for making the slide for me on this. So across the top in the white lettering against the darker blue background is the name of the caucus. And what I did on the left-hand side is sort of pose issues that came out of my reading of the issues, the wrong word, because that sort of the points that came up that the different caucuses made in the course of the reading. And it's basically with a couple of exceptions, it's points that at least 2 caucuses made, so that we could have some comparison. Before, it should be kept in mind throughout this that all these caucuses are they're in DSA, so they are they oppose capitalism. They all believe that capitalism oppresses and exploits. They are all for a strong labor movement. All are socialist feminist. All are anti-racist. All are internationalist. All recognize the urgency of the climate crisis. So you're not going to see those things by and large in this graph. So that's, they have that common foundation, that common agreement. So I've listed topics where there might be some differences. But it's also important to bear in mind that the caucuses did not issue their statements in response to a particular set of questions or in response to a survey. So the fact that a caucus didn't mention something where another caucus did doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't mean that they don't agree with the statement made by another group or another caucus. It's just that for whatever reason, they did not choose to include that in their statement of principles, probably statements that they tried to keep as short as possible. All right, so starting with the first point in the upper left, did the caucus define itself as Marxist or communist? Emerge, Reform and Revolution, and Winter all did. North Star does not. They didn't mention that in their statement. I will say though that especially Winter and Emerge, they define themselves that way, but they don't explain what that means. I think that reflects the fact that they're kind of operating in a bubble where they think that everybody has a common understanding of what those terms mean. I don't think that's accurate, but that's their call. But it has it manifests itself politically. There was a good example in Winter's statement on the opening of their statement. I think just maybe even their first paragraph. It says, as Marxists, we are tasked with building the consciousness and capacity of working people to fight for the transition from capitalism to socialism. So you have to ask, are non-Marxist socialists have a different task? Do anarchists have a different task than those things? What is it about being Marxists that gives us that task, or gives members of Winter that task? And they don't explain that at all. Reform and Revolution is a little bit better about explaining what they mean when they call themselves Marxists, and some of that stuff emerges at other points. Obviously, elections and the question of relationship to the Democratic Party is a big deal, rightly so, in DSA. I'm not trying to minimize it anyway. So Emerge, Reform and Revolution, and Winter are all for independence from the Democratic Party, having an independent party, independent of the Democratic Party in the near term. They don't get into how that's going to happen. And sometimes, in part of it, you think they're just going to, they think that DSA is strong enough that it should just declare the existence of a new party. Reform and Revolution is a little bit different in that they They support voting for, how do they put it? They support voting for left-wing candidates running on the Democratic Party line at this time. They do not take a position of no support for people on the Democratic Party line, but they do think that DSA should be actively working towards founding an independent political organization. And they give examples of looking for places where people would run an independence or run on a socialist line rather than running in the Democratic Party. North Star, on the other hand, sees running as part of the Democratic Party as a long-term strategy. They are, in a number of areas, they repeatedly come back to the idea of forming broad coalitions, and they see being in the Democratic Party as part of being a broad center-left coalition, and they see it as while I don't think they would rule out ever being part of an independent political party. They don't see it as a prospect in the near future, or as a prospect that really DSA should be working for. And part of their explanation for that is that DSA has grown as dramatically as it has since 2016, precisely because of using the Democratic Party line has enabled DSA and Democratic Socialists to get some of their ideas out and to attract people. And why give up on something that's working to that extent? Reform and Revolution and Winter specifically mention identity politics in their platforms, and both oppose identity politics. Winter probably more vigorously than Revolution does, in the sense they view it. I think they describe it as the product of elites who are seeking to prevent class, the formation of class politics. As I mentioned earlier, all of the groups, all the caucuses define themselves as anti-imperialist, and I have that on here for two reasons. One, Emerge specifically, and they were the only ones who did this, called for decolonization of the United States. They describe the U.S. as a settler colonial nation state, and they call for decolonization with no further explanation of what that means or how that might come about. And then two of the caucuses, Reform and Revolution and North Star, both explicitly cite their support for self-determination for all nations. And so it's interesting to then look a little further. So I posed a question for myself of Ukraine, which is a little tricky with this, because all of the statements, all of these caucuses were formed prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So they did not specifically address in their statements of principles or their founding papers the question of the war. So here's two caucuses who do mention their support for the self-determination of all nations. However, they've taken very different positions on the question of the war in Ukraine. So Reform and Revolution has just this week submitted a resolution, I believe, to joint resolution or with the Marxist Unity Group that stresses that the war is a proxy war and opposes arms to Ukraine because it serves U.S. imperial interests. North Star, on the other hand, who state that the U.S. is not the only imperialist power, and I wonder about that statement, because they make a point on their webpage of saying that their principles of unity were amended in fall of 2022. And so I didn't pursue it any further. It's certainly possible that the inclusion of that language that the U.S. is not the only imperialist power, was done at that time and reflects their position on the war in Ukraine. They have called for on Twitter. I've seen they have tweeted that Russia holds the main responsibility for the war and should withdraw. And they basically have supported sending arms to Ukraine. Interestingly, given, and again, I don't want to read too much into something not being present in the statement. 3 of the caucuses make a point of stating that they think the struggle against racism is central to the formation of working class politics and socialist organization. R&R, Reform Revolution, specifically states that white workers have benefited from white supremacy, and goes on to point out that if that weren't the case, then white supremacy wouldn't work. People have to think they're getting people have to get something out of it for it to continue to hold the sway that it does. They both agree, both Reform Revolution and North Star agree that racism in the working class must be acknowledged and directly confronted as part of building a class struggle, working class movement. Emerge rejects the idea of fighting exclusively around class-wide demands. Presumably they're saying that because they believe somebody is advocating that, but they don't identify who that might be. Similarly, Reform Revolution and North Star both reject what they call class reductionism. And Reform Revolution in particular cites Bernie Sanders and Debs, criticizes Bernie Sanders and Debs for their holding a perspective that they identify as class reductionist, which they define as reducing all social issues to class issues. I do want to point out that their statements, Reform Revolution and North Stars anyway, came out before the 2020 election. And I think that there were certainly people who felt that Sanders' campaign was, in these terms, class reductionist in 2016, who thought that it was better in 2020 than it had. And so, whether or not Reform Revolution would frame things in that same way if they were issuing a statement after the 2020 election, I don't know. The 2 of the groups indicate that they think that they are for DSA having a goal of becoming a mass socialist party, whatever that means, and whatever it takes to get there is unclear. Interestingly, for caucuses in a socialist organization, only 2 of the caucuses specifically deal with socialism and what it might look like, what the structure of a socialist economy might be. Reform and Revolution calls for public ownership of the top 500 corporations. They dismiss co-ops as a means of undermining capitalism, but do think that they will have a role in a socialist economy. And North Star in this it opposes what they call predatory capitalism, but they don't, and I don't want to read too much into this, but I'm always worried of when somebody modifies capitalism to make it sound worse, as if capitalism by itself is okay in some way. So predatory capitalism, or the hyper greedy capitalism, all this stuff. So they're against predatory capitalism. They don't say whether they're against capitalism itself, but therefore they call in a socialist economy, this is North Star, calls for a robust public sector, vigorous regulation, and worker co-ops. So they clearly see an ongoing role for private ownership and private companies, and that's and I'm not trying to, again, I'm not trying to make too much of that. I mean, the Bolsheviks did not intend to nationalize the entire economy. Cuba did not start out trying to nationalize the economy. There's been for 100 years since the Russian Revolution, there's been discussion about what role should be allotted to private capital in a socialist economy. But nobody in this selection, comes out for nationalization of the economy entirely. It's sort of major sections of it, or this vigorous regulation. All of them had something to say about how DSA should function internally. Emerge sort of focuses on the need for greater transparency and a collective determination of strategy. Two of the groups, Reform Revolution and Winter, both cite horizontalism as a problem in DSA, and that they're against that, and they think that makes the organization less democratic, both less democratic and less effective than it could be. They both talk about the need to hold socialists in office, SOI, accountable for their actions as elected officials. And there's some brief discussion about what that might involve and how they should be answerable to the national leadership of the organization. North Star, on the other hand, while also, their focus is sort of on the tone of discussion in DSA, there for a healthier internal discussion, but they specifically, interestingly, sort of come to the defense of paper members. They think that, the idea that somebody's a paper member, that just shouldn't be a term we use, that people are going to have different levels of involvement, and they're going to move back, and they're going to change over time, and somebody's willing to step up and make a commitment of a certain amount of money, and at this time, if that's all they feel they can do, we welcome that, and hopefully at another point in time they'll be more active. And North Star is, they think that the attention paid to holding socialists in office, I did that wrong. It's SIO, isn't it? Not OI. Socialists in office accountable is a waste.
My mistake.
Is it? I think it's my mistake, probably. And that we shouldn't publicly criticize, AOC or Bowman or others, that they're under enough pressure from the right, that they should not feel that pressure from the left, and we should do what we can to support them against the onslaught they're going to face. Jeffrey asked me to define what horizontalism is, and I'm going to leave that to discussion. I actually think there may be people who are better situated to define that than I am, but certainly part of it is the idea that, or the critique of it is that there's not majority rule. You don't have a discussion and arrive at a decision, and you live with that and work it out. That there's always just decisions made without, frankly, the criticism is without really coming to a real decision, a real conclusion that people can test and come back and argue about later on and maybe change. Emerge is the only one of the caucuses that specifically mentions decarceration as important, and Emerge and North Star both highlight the importance of fighting the right. Emerge would probably refer to it as anti-fascist organizing, and for them, they're really raising the necessity for physical confrontation. Defending Drag Queen Story Hour, for example, and just going out, being prepared to have physical confrontation with the right. North Star makes fighting the right really kind of central to their perspective, and for them, it's an argument in favor of building the broadest possible coalition against the right, and therefore which will necessitate, being willing to agree on, a lesser set of politics or less socialist politics than we might otherwise prefer. And part of their argument for staying involved in the Democratic Party is this part of this build a broad coalition, unite the center with the left to fight the right. So that's my capsule summary. Just a couple notes, and certainly anybody can, if you know better, because I'm kind of guessing on this. North Star, I think, probably has the largest percentage of people who were members of DSA before 2016. They sort of make a point of how they are long-term and newer members, but they include quite a few people who were in DSA and even in their preceding organizations of DSOC and NAM. I believe that Reform and Revolution originated as a split from Socialist Alternative, and largely around the question of whether or not to be involved in DSA. Obviously, the votes from Reform and Revolution were in favor of being involved in DSA, left Social Alternative, joined DSA, went on to start this caucus. Now, the irony of that is Socialist Alternative has since then made that same decision to be involved in DSA. and has set up their own caucus, which we will be discussing in 2 weeks, I believe. So the floor is yours.
Should I keep the chart up or can I stop sharing?
I guess keep it up.
Okay.
But once